Welcome back to the course on the Supreme Court and American politics. When we were together the last time, we were beside the Supreme Court building, and now we have moved into another world altogether. We are now in the political realm, and you see behind me the Capitol of the United States, where the Senate and the House sit. The chamber that is closest to us here is the House of Representatives, which is the most representative body in our federal government, because the people choose the representatives in that body entirely according to the population of their state. On the other side of the Capitol is the Senate, and the states are represented there, and their people, of course. Now, as you know your history, you know that that arrangement was part of the original compromise at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 in order to persuade the small states that the Constitution would favor them in some way and encourage them, therefore, to ratify the Constitution. The political world is very much different than the judicial world. And this lecture for week 2 is focusing on the political arrangements that are made by our Constitution. But remember throughout this lecture that those political arrangements are enforced by the actions of the Supreme Court of the United States, at least when they reach the court in the form of a constitutional question. Now, the most direct way by which the political process exercises influence over the court is through the process by which judges, or justices in this case, are selected. Under the Constitution, the President of the United States makes the nominations to the Supreme Court of the United States, and he sends those up to the Senate. And remember, by the way, the Senate is not the most representative body, but the Senate then has the authority to advise and consent, which is a formal sort of way of saying they have the authority to approve or to disapprove of the President's nomination. If they approve, that justice becomes a member of the Supreme Court, and you will recall from our first week's discussion that justice can sit on the court for life as long as the justice engages in good behavior. Now, I mentioned the absence of a representative body's involvement in the process because, just to remind you, the House of Representatives plays no role whatsoever in the nomination process. Why are we going to spend so much time this week, and why did you spend so much time in the readings for this week talking about representation? But representation is really the only way by which voting and elections are made effective under our constitutional order. Our founders were very familiar with English history, and they were particularly aware of what had been happening actually since the 11th century, when the Normans invaded from across the Channel and set up their own government and began for the first time to challenge the idea that sovereignty lay only with the king or queen of England. And gradually over the following centuries, the process became one in which Parliament, which was an elected body, asserted more and more control over the prerogatives of the crown, that is, the powers of the king and queen. So in 1215, for example, the barons in the fields at Runnymede in England persuaded, actually coerced King John into recognizing some rights of the barons. And from their action that day in 1215, we have the heritage of Magna Carta, which is often cited as the foundation in our Constitution for such rights as trial by jury. So gradually there were checks upon the sovereign power of the king and queen, the royalty of Britain. Gradually, as this unfolded, the colonies were developing their own local government. But gradually those local governments, dealing with matters of concern to them locally, insisted upon having increasing power. But they also were aware, very much aware, of the teachings of political theorists in England, particularly John Locke, who articulated the theory that the sovereignty lies with the people because government can exercise power over them only with the consent of the governed. And the colonists were taking that very seriously in their local legislatures. So they were beginning to insist on what was called popular sovereignty. It simply means that the people are the ones who hold ultimate government power. Now, in our history, there was discussions of two different ways by which sovereignty could be exercised by the people. They could do it democratically by having themselves be the governing body. Now, in our current time, this is still practiced in New England in the town halls. The people who come to the town halls are the government. Now, the other theory, the alternative theory to that, is the people exercise their power through a republic, a republican form of government. That simply means that the people themselves do not run the government. They elect representatives to do their governmental affairs on their behalf. And this goes back to Locke, that if you are going to be governed by someone else, that someone else or that entity must have your consent. And so Americans grew up in the colonial period believing that they, the people, were sovereign. Now, there had been elements of these experiments in England and elsewhere in Europe, but America was the first to actually establish a government based upon the theory of popular sovereignty, that is, government with the consent of the governed. And they did so by, in the first place, creating what was called the Articles of Confederation.